Hi, I'm Stephen J. Pemberton, and I'm going to read you an extract from my fantasy novel, The Dragons of Asdanund, which is Book 2 of the Schemes of Raltarn and Tomaz. There are some major spoilers in this reading for the previous book in the series, The Mirrors of Elangir, so if you haven't read that, you might want to go and find something else to watch. So if you're still here, we'll get started. A drizzly mist had descended by the time we got close enough to Glorious to hail her. To nobody's surprise, the lookout shouts produced no response. The warship hadn't moved since we spotted her an hour ago. She seemed to be listing. Had she struck a rock? I'd thought the sea was quite deep here. "Raltarn!" My father, Raltarn, called to me from the main deck, where he stood by my uncle, his brother Tomaz. I still hadn't got used to his being alive after a decade of believing he'd been killed in a burglary gone wrong, and I still hadn't quite forgiven Uncle for not telling me the truth about him. I descended from the forecastle, moving slowly so as not to slip on the wet planks. Father gestured to Uncle and said, "Will you talk some sense into him?" "I don't understand," I said. "The captain wants to send the boat over to the warship," said Father. "I don't see how that's any concern of ours," I said. "Besides, if this mist settles, we're stuck here until the wind gets up enough to clear it." "No good will come of this," Father replied. "There's nobody above deck. Half her sails are missing and the rest are frittered. But she couldn't have been caught in a storm because she was only half a day ahead of us. And she's not flying a distress flag, so whatever happened quickly." "If there's something around here that's a danger to a warship," I said, "we ought to know about it." "No," said Father, "we ought to get away from it." "If the captain wants to investigate," said Uncle, "we investigate." "You're his employers," said Father. "Tell him you're in a hurry to get back to Asdanund." "We are," I replied, "but the captain of Glorious said we were obliged to help them under the emergency articles. He never rescinded that order, as far as I know." "He abandoned you," Father exclaimed. "We abandoned him, strictly speaking," said Uncle. "And even without the emergency articles, what about the well-being of your fellow men? I've never known you to show much concern for that," Father muttered. A splash from the other side of the ship told me our boat had been launched. Father's gaze shifted to the men climbing over the railing to descend to the boat. "Admit it, you're hoping the Elangir Baronescal put on that ship went mad and killed everyone, so you can help yourself to the artifacts he gave them." Uncle snorted. "If that is what I want, what are you so worried about?" Father's gaze returned to Glorious. "That not all of them are dead." It was too cold and damp to wait for the boat to come back, and if anything bad happened while they were searching Glorious, I didn't want to witness it. I'd already seen more than my share of horrors on this voyage. I headed below decks to our cabin. Zodratal lay on the bed, apparently asleep, but as soon as I closed the door, she jumped up and wrapped me in a bruising embrace and tried to kiss me on the mouth. I squirmed and turned my head, so the kiss landed on my cheek. Releasing me, she stepped back and gazed at me with an exaggerated, sad expression, like an actor trying to ensure he could be seen from the top of the theatre. "Raltarn," she said, her voice quavering. I straightened my clothes and gave her the tiniest smile I could manage. "Good afternoon, Zodratal." "Not to say me," she replied. Father had been teaching her Asdanundish, but hadn't got very far. The words were her best attempt at "don't say such things." She and Father had married the day after our escape from Baronescal's madness, which meant that by law and by custom she was now my mother. She was upset, or pretending to be upset, that I didn't care for the way Elangir women treated their sons, even the adult ones. She was also upset that I still called her by her name, rather than by her relationship to me. Father obviously loved Zodratal dearly, and had done for quite some time. I, on the other hand, had spent less than half an hour in her company before learning she was to become part of my family. I hardly remembered my own mother, and hadn't thought I wanted, or needed, a replacement. The fact she couldn't be over a decade older than me didn't make it any easier to adjust to my new situation. Then again, I was stuck with her on board Silver Dolphin for a few months until we got home to Asdanund, so I should at least make an attempt to be civil to her. I sighed. "Would you like to learn some more Asdanundish?" Her eyes lit up and she spread her arms. For a moment I feared another embrace, but she just said, "Learn Asdanund. Good, good." Good, good was something Baronoscal had said a lot. Maybe that was how the Elangics said yes. If so, how did they say yes to something they didn't like? "Right," I began. "Right," she repeated. I smiled and pointed to my head. "Head." "Head," she said, mimicking the gesture. "Arm," I said, indicating one of mine. "Arm," she said, then hands, fingers, chest, belly, back, leg, foot, pointing to each in turn. "Hair, eye, nose, mouth, ear." "Yes, very good," I said. Of course Father would have taught her those words. I tested her on a few to make sure she hadn't just memorized the order. My schoolmaster sometimes did that to catch us out. She got all of them right. I moved on to the names of objects in the cabin and found she knew all of those too. I managed to teach her the adjectives big and small, but couldn't work out how to convey bigger and smaller. I tried colours, but we didn't have enough objects of the same colour for me to be confident that she understood which property the words distinguished. We moved on to numbers. She quickly grasped 1 to 10, but larger quantities eluded her. She could manage addition if the result was 5 or less. Subtraction seemed a mystery to her. It was only when I asked her to count in Elangic that I realised she hadn't been taught the numbers beyond 10 in her own language. The cabin door opened and Father entered. Zodratel squealed and threw her arms around him. I averted my eyes as they kissed noisily. Anyone would think they'd been apart for months, not hours. Father spoke to Zodratel in Elangic. Her expression grew sombre. She answered him rapidly and at length. Twice she gestured to me, and Father paled both times she did this. What had I done? Or not done? Father turned to me. "The boat's come back from Glorious. Her crew are all dead." "Mazor have mercy," I whispered. "Many of them have wounds from Elangic weapons." "So you were right that Baronoscal's people went mad?" "Not quite. Some of the crew were holding weapons." "There was a fight then," I said, "and they killed one another." "Perhaps. What were they fighting over, I wonder? And what does this have to do with me?" "There's one survivor," Father said. "One of Baronoscal's people. The woman. She's barricaded herself in the galley. She speaks little or no Asdanundish, so our captain wants Zodratel to talk to her. Zodratel's not keen on the idea. She asked why I'd risk leaving you half-orphaned for a second time." It took me a moment to work out what he meant. "What's the danger?" "The woman has an Elangic weapon, and she's not shy about using it." "We could just leave her there," I said. He frowned. "I thought I brought you up better than that." "Blame Tomaz," I muttered. "The Navy will want to know what happened to Glorious, as will the crew's families. We have to recover her log and her flags, neither of which are kept anywhere near the galley," I said. "And we need to take the weapons and other artifacts, to stop the Elangics from regaining them, even if they don't change the course of the war. You said they didn't have any boats." "I never saw them using boats. Remember, I was in a room with no windows for most of the time I was there." I shuddered. Being locked up in a place like that for 10 years, it was a miracle he was still sane, never mind that he'd been able to fall in love with Zodratel. "If it was up to me," Father said, "I'd invite the woman to take off in one of the warship's boats, then burn the whole sorry mess to the waterline, weapons, artifacts and all. But since it's not up to me, I'll just have to talk the captain out of recklessly endangering the life of a passenger." He murmured to Zodratel, and they left the cabin hand in hand. I sat on the bed, tempted to lie down for a nap. Since Father and Zodratel came aboard, they'd had the cabin that Uncle and I had occupied on the voyage out. We now had to bunk with the crew, whose beds were much less comfortable than the ones in the cabin. Someone knocked on the door. I opened it to see Solm, the ship's third mate. He had a sword at his belt, and my suspicions about his motives were reawakened. When Glorious had caught up with us on the voyage out, he'd hidden the Elangic artifacts that Uncle and I already possessed to stop the Navy confiscating them. He'd convinced us to trust him by telling us he was an officer in the White Dragons, an organisation that was trying to force a peaceful end to the war by sabotaging the Asdanundish army's operations. If he betrayed us, he'd said, we could simply tell the captain of Glorious who he really was. At the back of my mind had been the thought that to someone like him, betray was likely to mean kill at the first opportunity, but he'd given us lots of practical assistance and good advice. He'd helped Uncle and me to rescue Father when everyone else had wanted to get away from Elangir as quickly as possible. But now that everyone who posed an immediate threat to his freedom or his life was dead... "The captain wants to see you," Soln said. Those weren't words I would have expected from a man who meant to murder me. "About what?" I asked. "Glorious," he said, as though it was a stupid question. He stood aside to let me out of the room. I gestured to indicate he should go first. He shrugged, as if there would be plenty of other chances to kill me, then complied. I followed Soln the short distance to the captain's cabin at the stern. He tapped on the door, then opened it. Father, Zodratal, and Captain Rymad sat at the table, while First Mate Gribech, Second Mate Ingrin, and Uncle stood opposite them. I moved next to Uncle. "Raltarn," said Rymad, "thank you for joining us." He repeated what Father had told me about the situation on Glorious. "Since her crew are all dead and no other naval vessel is nearby, this is now a salvage operation. Our first objective is to disarm the Elangic woman and remove her from the ship, peacefully if possible, by force if necessary. Then we'll perform funerals for the crew and determine whether the ship is still seaworthy enough to sail to a friendly port. Though even if she is, I doubt we can spare enough men for her. Early in the voyage we'd lost 8 men in a terrible storm and had yet to replace them. If she's not able to make that journey, we'll take anything useful or valuable that we've room for and scuttle her to stop her falling into enemy hands." Nobody questioned his implication that Elangir was an enemy now. Baronoskol had tried to sink us as we'd left his harbour. The fact he'd blown himself up in the process didn't mean his comrades wouldn't want to pick up where he left off. "I agree with all of that, Captain," said Father. "It's in accordance with the law of the sea, but I don't see why Zodratal, my wife, has to go." "She speaks the woman's language," said Rymad, "and the presence of a woman in our group might help to convince the Elangic that our intentions are friendly." Father and Zodratal spoke in Elangic for a few moments. She glanced at Rymad and rolled her eyes. "She doesn't know this woman, sir," said Father. "But many people in Turakingat knew that Zodratal spent a lot of time visiting me in prison. So if the woman recognizes her, she'll assume she's turned traitor." "She has turned traitor," Soln remarked. "I'd rather we didn't draw the woman's attention to that before we've disarmed her," Father replied. "You're aware, of course," said Rymad, "that I could simply order someone to kill her." "You could simply leave her there and sail on," said Uncle. "No one back home has to know what happened on the ship." He looked around us, inviting agreement. "You're a bigger fool than I thought," said Rymad, "if you expect every man on Silver Dolphin to lie for you." He held Uncle's gaze for a moment, then added, "We have to act soon. She could be using one of those mirrors to summon reinforcements." "I'd say they have their hands full cleaning up the harbour," said Ingrin. "We have to give her a chance to surrender," I said. "There's been too much killing on this voyage already." "Easy for you to say," said Gribech, "when you're not the one facing down her weapon." "We're getting away from the most important point," said Father. Rymad glared at him. "Which is?" "There's no need to send Zodratal. I'll go instead. My Elangic is more than good enough to say, 'Surrender or we'll kill you.'" "If we want her to surrender, then you need to go anyway," Rymad replied, "to act as an interpreter." "Exactly," said Father. "We also need someone to wield the one Elangic weapon that we currently have," said Rymad. "I'd better do that," said Soln, "seeing as I'm the only person on board who's deliberately killed somebody with one of them." That wasn't strictly true. I'd killed a hostile native on Crothtror, though it hadn't been entirely deliberate, and in any case I had no desire to repeat the experience. "Good," said Rymad. "That leaves Raltarn." My heart skipped. "Me?" He gazed at me. "Something went very wrong on that ship within a few days of leaving Turakingat. There are 2 obvious things that were different from our voyage out. One is that there were a couple of Elangics on board. The other is that she was carrying a large number of magical artifacts." Uncle snorted. "You think all the cooking pots in the hold drove them mad?" "Not really, but nobody has ever carried that many artifacts on a ship, or not an Asdanundish one anyway. We don't know what the dangers are." "And you think I can tell you?" I said. "If not you, who else?" said Rymad. "You're the only magician we have. You can tell when an artifact is working. And didn't Baronoscal give you something that lets you see magic? He did, but good. Meet me on the main deck in half an hour. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that extract from the Dragons of Asdanund. If you'd like to read more or find out where to buy your own copy, please visit my website at www.pembers.net. Thank you.